The moment I saw the boarding pass in his hand, something in me went still before it went warm. Not the good kind of still. The kind that comes right before your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. "Just you," Thomas said, smiling too wide. "First class. A whole week. You deserve it." I should have felt only joy. And for a moment I did. 26 years of marriage, and my husband was still capable of surprising me. A solo trip to Paris. A hotel booked entirely in my name. Nothing shared, nothing split. Just mine. My name is Carolyn Bennett. And I've learned that the sweetest gifts sometimes come wrapped around something you're not meant to see. "Which hotel?" I asked, still holding the tickets like they might dissolve in my hands. "The Lutetia," he said. Fast. Too fast. Like he'd rehearsed the answer before I'd even finished the question. I laughed it off, told myself he was just excited, same as me. Thomas had never been a man who planned ahead. Not for our anniversary, not even for his own birthday most years. So when he handed me a full itinerary, printed and folded, hotel confirmation number circled in blue ink, I chose to feel flattered instead of curious. I packed that evening with my hands moving faster than my thoughts. Sundresses, my good perfume, the pearl earrings his mother gave me the year we got married. I remember thinking, maybe this is us finding our way back to something. Thomas carried my suitcase to the car himself, kissed my forehead at the door like a man seeing his bride off, not his wife of half a lifetime. "Call me when you land," he said. "I'll be counting the hours." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. It was Silas who stopped me. He'd worked our ground since before Thomas and I ever exchanged vows, a fixture on that property longer than the marriage itself, trusted by my own mother before she passed. He came around the side of the house just as the taxi pulled up, moving faster than I'd seen him move in years. He grabbed my arm at the car door. Not rough. Urgent. "Ma'am, please don't go," he said, his voice low, cracking in a way I'd never heard from him. "Just trust me." I searched his face for something, a joke, an explanation, anything to make sense of the fear sitting behind his eyes. He gave me nothing. Just held my arm a second longer than was proper, then let go like he'd already said too much. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that pull in your gut when something looks perfect but doesn't sit right, drop your city below. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. I told myself it was nothing. Silas was getting older. Maybe he'd misheard something, misread something, gotten spooked by nothing at all. I had a flight to catch and a marriage I still believed in. I got in the taxi anyway. I left my phone off in my bag the whole ride. Didn't want the driver seeing my hands shake as I typed. Didn't want to look like a foolish woman clutching her phone over some old man's warning. I told myself I was being silly, paranoid, ungrateful for a gift my husband had planned for weeks. But as the car pulled off our street, I looked back once at our house, at Thomas standing in the doorway, watching me leave with an expression I couldn't quite name. He didn't wave. He just stood there, watching, like a man making sure I was really gone. We were 3 minutes from the highway when I told the driver I'd forgotten something. I don't know where the lie came from. It just arrived, fully formed, the way truth sometimes does when your body knows more than your mind is willing to admit. "Just drop me back near the property," I said. "I'll call another car after." He didn't ask questions. I paid him in cash, added enough on top that he'd remember me as generous, not strange, and watched his taillights disappear down the road before I let myself move. I stood there a moment in my traveling clothes, suitcase handle still warm from my grip, feeling like the most foolish woman in North Carolina. "What are you doing, Carolyn?" Silas had said 4 words. 4 words. And I'd turned my whole evening inside out on the strength of an old man's grip on my arm. What if he was wrong? What if he'd seen a delivery truck and mistaken it for something sinister? What if Thomas was standing in that doorway right now, confused, waiting on a call from the airport that would never come, and I was about to humiliate us both over nothing? I almost turned back toward the road twice, but my feet kept walking the tree line instead, the same stretch of pines I used to cut through as a girl, back when this land still belonged to my mother and not yet to a marriage. I knew every root that could trip me, every gap in the fence Thomas never noticed, because he'd never once walked this property the way I had. The house came into view through the trees, and something in my chest went cold before I could name why. It was too quiet, not late evening quiet, not the kind of stillness that comes when everyone's simply gone in for the night. This was the quiet of a house that had been emptied on purpose. No kitchen light where Marguerite usually stood finishing dinner. No sound of the outdoor speakers Thomas liked running low in the evenings. No staff car in the side lot where at least one always sat until 9. Every single one of them was gone. On a Tuesday. Without a word to me. I let myself into the guest house through the side door, the key still on my ring from years of storing linens out here, and I stood in the dark for a long moment without moving, listening to my own breathing like it might give me away. I kept my phone off. Some instinct, sharper than reason, told me a lit screen in a dark window was exactly the kind of mistake that gets a woman caught. I hadn't done anything wrong, I reminded myself. I was hiding in my own guest house like a criminal, over nothing but a warning with no explanation behind it. I almost laughed at myself, standing there in the dark in my traveling dress, imagining how this would sound if I ever had to explain it to anyone. A grown woman, sneaking back onto her own land, hiding from her own home. But the silence outside that window kept pressing against the glass, patient and wrong in a way I couldn't argue myself out of. Something told me to stay exactly where I was. So I did. The headlights came first. 2 beams sweeping low across the gravel, cutting through the dark like they already knew exactly where they were going. No hesitation. No searching for an address. Whoever was driving had been here before. I pressed myself against the cold window frame of the guest house and watched a black van roll to a stop near the side entrance. The one hidden from the main road, the one visitors never used unless they didn't want to be seen arriving. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. Because parked just behind the tool shed, tucked at an angle no one would notice unless they were looking for it, sat Thomas's car. He was supposed to be at the airport by now. He was supposed to be pacing some terminal, phone in hand, waiting on my call from 30,000 feet in the air. My hand flew to my mouth before I even understood why. I clamped it there, over my nose too, forcing my breath down into something small and silent, because some animal part of me already knew, before my mind had finished the sentence, that if I made one sound, everything about to happen would happen to me instead of around me. 3 men climbed out of the van, dark clothes, ski masks pulled low, gloves on every hand. They moved like men who'd done this before, quick, practiced, no wasted motion, straight through the side door Thomas himself must have left unlocked for them. I watched them come back out minutes later, carrying things I recognized with a sickness that spread slow through my chest. The silver Thomas's grandmother left us. The clock from the study. A wrapped painting I knew the shape of even under its blanket. Not stolen. Removed. One of them, the tallest, stopped near the van's open door and said something low to the others, something about hurrying, about the house being empty enough, about no one being around to see any of this. He wasn't whispering. He didn't think he needed to. Because why would he? Thomas had made sure of it. Staff gone. Wife on a plane to Paris. an empty house swallowing every sound whole. Except I recognized that voice before my mind could stop it from landing. Larry. Not just Larry's build, or Larry's walk, though I saw both now, plain as day, once I let myself really look. His voice. The particular way he clipped his words at the end of a sentence. A habit I'd heard 100 times over Sunday dinners these past weeks, sitting at my own table like family should. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from making a single sound. My phone sat useless in my bag by the door, powered off, exactly the way I'd left it. Some part of me reached for it anyway. Some instinct screaming, record this, capture this, you'll need proof. Before reason caught up and stopped my hand cold. A screen lighting up in a dark window. A shutter click carrying further than I could risk in this silence. I had nothing but my own eyes and whatever my memory could hold on to in the dark. So I made myself remember. The van, the men, Thomas's car, hidden like a secret. Larry's voice, clear as a bell in a house he believed was empty. I held my breath until the van doors slammed shut, until the engine rolled back down the drive the way it came, patient, unhurried, certain of itself. Then I heard footsteps crossing the gravel, slow, coming toward the guest house. The steps creaked once, and every part of me went rigid. I'd been so still for so long that my own body had started to feel foreign to me. Arms locked, breath shallow, back pressed flat against the wall beside the window, like the plaster itself might hide me better than my own stillness could. Then the second creak came. Closer. Someone was climbing the guest house steps. I don't remember deciding to hold my breath. It simply happened, the way your hand pulls back from a flame before your mind finishes the thought, that's hot. I stood there in the dark, counting my own heartbeat in my ears, certain that whoever was outside could hear it too. Footsteps crossed the small porch. Slow. Deliberate. Circling once, like someone checking a door they already expected to be locked, testing a window they already suspected wouldn't budge. I thought of every version of what came next. Someone finding me crouched in my own guest house in last night's traveling clothes. No explanation that wouldn't sound insane. Or worse, someone deciding not to bother with explanations at all. Then, just as suddenly as they'd come, the footsteps moved on. Down the steps, across the gravel, fading into the same silence that had swallowed the van 20 minutes before. I didn't move for a long time after that. Long enough that my legs ached from holding one position. Long enough that the sky outside had shifted from black to something softer, grayer, less certain of itself. It was only then, sitting finally on the cold floor with my knees pulled to my chest, that I let myself go back over everything. Slowly, piece by piece. The way you press on a bruise to see how deep it really goes. The van, the men. Thomas's car hidden behind the shed like something ashamed of itself. Larry's voice, clipped and careless, certain no one was listening. And then, unbidden, a detail rose up from somewhere beneath all the fear. Something my eyes had caught without my mind fully registering it at the time. Too busy holding my own breath to do anything but stare. In that first sweep of headlights before the men had even climbed out, I remembered my gaze dropping instinctively to the plate, the way anyone's eyes might, some old habit of noticing a strange car in a familiar place. I hadn't thought about it again in the chaos that followed. But sitting here now, replaying that single frozen second, I could see it clearly, the way a photograph develops slow in a dark room. One corner of that plate had been smeared with mud. Not the kind that happens from driving down a dirt road. The deliberate kind. A thumb dragged across a single corner, just enough to blur one number into unreadable. Nobody does that by accident. My stomach turned over slow. The way it does when a suspicion stops being a feeling and starts becoming a fact you can't unknow. I reached for my phone out of habit more than plan. Some old instinct wanting to write it down before it slipped away from me. But I stopped myself before my thumb even touched the button. A screen lighting up now, in this stillness, after everything that had just happened outside. I couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until I understood who might still be close enough to notice a glow behind a curtain. So I held the detail the same way I'd held my breath. Carefully, silently, refusing to let it go. Whoever had smeared that plate knew exactly what they were protecting themselves from. And I was starting to understand exactly who that person was protecting it from too. Sirens woke the property before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. I flinched at the sound, my whole body still aching from a night spent folded into stillness, and pressed myself carefully to the edge of the guest house window, moving the curtain back only far enough to see. 2 patrol cars sat in the drive, lights turning slow and silent now. And there stood Thomas in the doorway of our home, one hand pressed to his chest like a man trying to hold his own heart in place. "I don't understand," he was saying, his voice cracking in exactly the right places. I came back to grab something I forgot, and the back door was standing wide open." I went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. I had walked past that same back door hours before, cutting through the dark toward the guest house, moving quiet and careful along the tree line the way I used to as a girl. I remembered it clearly, shut, locked, the small brass bolt Thomas always complained about, sticking in humid weather, catching the moonlight for just a second before I looked away. It had not been standing open. Not at that hour. Not until whatever happened after I was already hidden and holding my breath through the sound of that van. I watched him repeat the story to the officers, watched his hands find just the right tremor, his eyes find just the right shine, and understood in that moment that I was looking at a man who had rehearsed grief the same careful way he'd rehearsed the name of a hotel 2 nights before. An officer walked the perimeter of the main house, notepad in hand, nodding along to every detail Thomas offered. Another crouched near the same back door, examining the frame for signs of forced entry that I already suspected he wouldn't find, because nothing about that door had been forced. It had simply been left open by someone who wanted it to look that way. Neither of them so much as glanced toward the guest house. Thomas never mentioned it in his statement. Not once, not even in passing. The way you'd expect a man cataloging his whole property after a break-in. It sat unused most of the year, separately keyed, the kind of structure easy to forget existed unless you had reason to remember it. I understood, standing there in last night's clothes with my pulse hammering in my throat, that this omission wasn't carelessness. It was precision. I stayed low, watching through the gap in the curtain as the officers finished their walkthrough, jotting notes, offering Thomas the same gentle, useless reassurances people offer men they believe have lost something precious. One of them rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. Thomas thanked him, voice thick, and I had to look away from how convincing it was. Because somewhere behind that performance was a man who had stood in this very doorway last night, waiting for a wife he believed was already 30,000 feet in the air. I could not step out from behind that curtain. Not yet. Not with nothing but a lie about a locked door and a memory only I could confirm. So I stayed exactly where I was, watching my husband cry for a crime only one of us knew the truth about. I waited until the patrol cars pulled off the property before I let myself move. Even then, I didn't walk toward the house. I cut back through the same tree line that had carried me here the night before, emerging onto the county road nearly a mile down, where no one watching our gate would think to look. My legs shook the whole walk, not from exhaustion, though there was plenty of that sitting heavy in my bones. From the sheer weight of what I now had to do, walk back into my own home and become someone I wasn't. A gas station sat at the crossroads, half asleep at that hour, one register clerk barely glancing up from her phone. I called a cab from a number taped beside the register, paid the driver cash when he pulled up, gave a name that wasn't mine, and sat in the back of a sedan that smelled like pine air freshener, rehearsing a story I needed to believe myself before anyone else would. By the time the driver dropped me at the end of our drive, I'd built it whole in my mind. A missed connection, a delay nobody could have predicted. A woman who heard about a break-in at her own home from 30,000 feet away and turned back without a second thought. It helped, in a strange way, that Thomas had booked the entire trip himself, under his own accounts. Every confirmation, every itinerary, sent straight to his inbox instead of mine, since he'd wanted the surprise to stay a surprise until I was already at the gate. He had no ticket of his own to check against, no confirmation email of mine to hold up and question. Only my word, and his own guilt keeping him from looking too closely at it. Thomas met me at the door like a man who'd aged 5 years overnight. Carolyn. My name came out of him like something he was afraid to touch too hard. Thank God. Thank God you're... He stopped himself, pulling me into an embrace that felt, for just a moment, like the marriage I used to trust completely. I never boarded the connecting flight, I said into his shoulder, my voice trembling in a way that wasn't entirely performance. I saw the missed call. I saw 3 missed calls. I turned right back around. You didn't have to do that, he said, pulling back to look at me, his eyes searching my face with something that almost looked like relief fighting its way through something else. You could have, I don't know, finished the trip. There was nothing you could have done here. Thomas, someone broke into our home. Which airline rerouted you? He asked suddenly, too fast, the question slipping out before he seemed to fully intend it. I felt my whole body go still for half a second, the way it had the night before at the sound of footsteps on the porch. Then he caught himself, waved a hand like the question had never mattered at all. Doesn't matter, he said, laughing softly, though the laugh didn't quite reach the rest of his face. You're home. That's all that matters. You're safe. He pulled me close again, and I let him, resting my head against his chest the way I'd done 1,000 times before, listening now to something I'd never paid attention to in all our years together. The small, uneven rhythm of his heartbeat, quicker than it should have been for a man simply relieved his wife had come home safe. When I finally stepped back to set down my bag, I caught him watching me. Not the way a husband watches a wife he's grateful to see. A beat too long. A study, careful and searching. Gone the instant I met his eyes. He smiled and turned toward the kitchen, offering to make me tea like nothing in this house had changed overnight. But I had seen it. That half-second flicker, buried under all that relief. The same way I'd buried my own truth under a story about missed flights and turned-around cars. We were both lying to each other now. And for the first time since Silas grabbed my arm at that taxi door, I understood we might be better at it than either of us wanted to admit. I found Silas, 2 days later, kneeling in the dirt along the back fence line, pulling weeds he didn't need to pull. He didn't look up when I approached, just kept working his hands through the soil, shoulders drawn tight in a way I hadn't seen since his own wife passed some years back. Silas. Ma'am. He said it careful, guarded. A man choosing his footing on ice he didn't trust. I need you to tell me what you know. his hands stilled in the dirt. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and I let the silence sit between us, understanding that whatever he was weighing mattered more to him than it did to me. "I've worked this land 30 years, he said finally, still not looking up. "Your mother trusted me with it before you were ever married. I don't want to lose what little I got left over something I can't prove." "You already told me not to get in that car," I said. "You knew something was going to happen." He sat back on his heels then, finally meeting my eyes, and I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Not fear of Thomas, but fear for himself. The particular fear of an old man who understood exactly how easily people like him could be dismissed, discredited, erased from a story that powerful people didn't want told. "I'm not trying to lose everything I got," he said quietly, "but I also can't sit here and watch what's happening to you and say nothing." He told me slowly, like a man setting down something heavy, piece by piece. "Larry's car in our drive nearly every day the past 2 weeks. Always parked around back. Always gone before evening. Staff dismissed without explanation that same Tuesday morning. Marguerite sent home with a full day's pay and told not to come back until Thomas called for her, which struck Silas as strange even then, though he hadn't known what to do with the feeling. And there was talk," he said. "I was trimming near the study window, week before last. Didn't mean to hear nothing. But Mr. Thomas was on the phone, and he said something about needing everything settled before she's gone. Timing, he said. Something about timing." My chest went tight. The pieces I'd already gathered, the van, the voice, the smeared plate, the lie about the door, sliding into place around this new one like a lock, finally finding its key. "Anything else?" I said. Not a question. I needed there to be more. Silas hesitated again, longer this time, like he was deciding whether the last piece was even worth mentioning. "One more thing," he said. "Didn't think nothing of it at the time. Larry's car. It had one of them temporary tags. Dealer plate, paper one, taped in the window. Week before last. Same time he started coming around so much." The memory rose up fast and cold. That smeared corner on the van's plate. Deliberate. A thumb dragged across a number someone hadn't wanted read. A temporary dealer tag would explain exactly why someone might want it obscured. New, untraceable, easy to discard. "You're sure?" I said. "A dealer plate, not his regular one." "Sure as I'm kneeling here," Silas said. Didn't think a thing of it then. Man buys a new truck. That's all it seemed like. I stood there in the fading light, understanding for the first time that I wasn't the only one who'd been watching quietly while pretending not to notice anything at all. The phone rang at 11 that morning, and I was close enough to hear Thomas answer it from the hallway, close enough to hear the exact moment his voice changed. "This is Thomas Bennett." Warm. Practiced. The same voice he'd used for the officers, for the neighbors who'd called with sympathy, for every person who needed to believe him since that morning the sirens came. I stayed in the next room, folding towels I didn't need to fold, listening the way I'd learned to listen this past week. Quiet, still, gathering pieces of a picture no one knew I was assembling. "Yes, Mr. Harmon. Of course." A pause, longer than it should have been for a simple confirmation. Inconsistencies? Something in the way he said that word made me stop moving entirely. I couldn't hear the man on the other end, only Thomas's half of it, but I didn't need the rest. I could hear it in the careful spacing between his words, the same rehearsed calm I'd first noticed the night he handed me those Paris tickets, answering a question about a hotel a beat too fast. "I understand you have a process," Thomas said, "but I can assure you, everything in that report is accurate." Another pause, longer this time. "No, I don't have any reason to think the security footage would show anything unusual. It simply didn't capture the incident. That's what I was told by the technician. I set the towel down slow, careful not to make a sound, and moved just close enough to the doorway to see him without being seen myself. He was standing with his back half turned, phone pressed to his ear, free hand braced against the counter like he needed something solid beneath him. And for one unguarded second, just one, gone almost as fast as it appeared, his face lost every ounce of the composure he'd worn so well since that morning with the officers. His jaw went tight. His eyes closed, just briefly, the way a man's do when he's doing arithmetic he doesn't want the answer to. The hand on the counter curled into something close to a fist before he caught himself, exhaled slow, and smoothed his features back into the picture of a wronged, weary homeowner, cooperating fully with an insurance investigation. "Of course," he said, voice warm again, back in character. "Whatever you need from me. I want this resolved as much as you do." He hung up a moment later and stood there a beat longer than necessary, staring at nothing, before he noticed me in the doorway. "Adjuster," he said, waving a hand like it was nothing at all. "Just going over a few details. You know how these insurance people are, dragging their feet over paperwork while we're still trying to recover from all this." "Is everything all right?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, uncertain, exactly the tone a devastated wife should carry. "Fine," he said, too quickly. "Completely fine." I nodded and turned back toward the towels, giving him nothing but the same trusting face I'd worn for him since the morning of the sirens. But I'd seen what I needed to see. A man who could perform grief flawlessly for police officers and neighbors alike had just cracked. However briefly, at the mention of a stranger asking questions he couldn't fully control. Someone else was starting to notice what I already knew. Thomas brought it up over dinner, so casually I almost missed the weight folded inside it. "The insurance people are asking a lot of questions," he said, cutting into his chicken like the sentence carried no more importance than the weather. "More than I expected, honestly." "Questions about what?" "Timeline stuff, mostly. When I left, when I got back, what time the trip was supposed to start." He didn't look up from his plate. "I might need you to back me up on some of it. If anyone calls." The fork in my hand went still. "Back you up how?" "Just confirm the timeline. That I dropped you at the airport that morning, that everything happened the way I said it did." He said it so easily, like he was asking me to confirm what side of the bed I slept on. "It's just a formality, Carolyn. In case they call." I made myself keep chewing, keep breathing, keep every muscle in my face arranged into the same soft concern I'd worn for over a week now. But inside, something had gone very cold and very clear. He wasn't just asking me to stay quiet anymore. He was asking me to speak, to put my own voice, my own name, onto a version of that morning I knew, with absolute certainty, was a lie. "Of course," I heard myself say. "Whatever you need." He smiled, relieved, and went back to his dinner like the conversation had cost him nothing at all. I sat there afterward, alone in the kitchen once he'd gone to bed, staring at the dark window over the sink, and understood something I'd been avoiding since the morning of the sirens. My silence had felt, until tonight, like safety, like a woman simply waiting, watching, gathering what she needed before she moved. But silence has a shelf life. It was one thing to say nothing while the story stayed his alone to tell. It was another thing entirely to be handed a script and asked to read my lines alongside him. If someone from that insurance company called and asked me directly whether I'd been dropped at the airport that morning, I would either have to lie to a stranger's face on Thomas's behalf or tell a truth that would blow my own careful silence apart before I had anywhere solid to land. I thought of Silas's warning at the taxi door, of the van, the mud-smeared plate, the door Thomas swore had been forced open when I knew it hadn't been, of the crack in his voice on the phone with that adjuster, gone as fast as it appeared. I had pieces, real ones, more than most women in my position would ever manage to gather. But pieces weren't enough anymore. Not if I was about to be asked to either betray myself or betray the truth, with no one standing beside me who understood what either choice would actually cost. I picked up my phone that night, not to call Thomas's world, but to search outside of it entirely, for someone who could tell me what my silence was actually worth and how much longer it could hold before it broke on its own. I needed a lawyer. Not eventually. Now, before anyone else asked me to lie for a man I could no longer trust to tell me the truth about anything at all. Regina Coates's office sat above a dry cleaner on the edge of downtown Winston-Salem. Small and unremarkable. Exactly the kind of place a woman could disappear into without anyone noticing she'd gone. I told her everything. The van, Thomas's car hidden behind the shed, Larry's voice, careless in a house he believed was empty, the smeared plate, the temporary dealer tag Silas remembered, the lie about a door I knew had been locked. I laid it all out across her desk like evidence I'd been carrying in my own chest for over a week, relieved just to finally set it down somewhere. She listened without interrupting, pen resting untouched beside a legal pad she never once wrote on. When I finished, she didn't tell me I'd done the right thing. She didn't tell me anything I wanted to hear at all. "What can you actually prove?" she said. Not a question, a test. I saw it. I heard him. I know his voice. "You know his voice from Sunday dinners," she said. "A defense attorney will ask you how many men have a similar build, a similar cadence, especially under a mask, in the dark, at a distance. What you believe and what you can prove in a courtroom are two very different things, Mrs. Bennett. And I need you to understand that difference before you take one more step." I sat back, stung, though I understood she wasn't wrong to press. "The plate," I said. "Silas remembers a temporary dealer tag on Larry's car that same week, which is corroboration, not proof, unless we can tie that tag to an actual vehicle registration. That's something we can look into, but it's not enough on its own. And I want you walking into this with clear eyes, not hope." "Then what do I do?" She leaned forward, folding her hands. "You understand the risk here isn't only that no one believes you," she said. "It's that your husband gets ahead of this first. If he senses you know something, a man capable of staging what you've described is capable of turning the story around before you ever open your mouth. Wives have been painted as unstable, as vindictive, as the ones who staged a disappearance themselves when they moved too soon without enough behind them." My stomach turned at the thought, cold and sudden. "You think he'd do that?" "I think a man protecting himself from prison will do whatever keeps him out of it," she said, "which is exactly why we don't move until we have to." "So, we do nothing?" "We do something," she said, quietly. "I have a contact who can find out, without raising any flags, whether an investigation is already underway on that insurance claim. If it is, that changes everything about our timeline. If it isn't, we may need to be the ones who start it, carefully, on our own terms." I sat with that a long moment, feeling the full weight of what she was describing settle over me. Not a rescue, not a rush toward justice, but a slow, careful war I hadn't fully understood I was already fighting. "And if I'm wrong about any of it?" I asked quietly. "If it falls apart?" "Then we'll know that before it costs you everything," she said. "That's what I'm here for." I left her office shaken in a way I hadn't expected, the comfort I'd hoped for replaced by something steadier and far more useful. Resolve. Detective Marcus Whitfield had the kind of face that gave nothing away. which I understood within minutes of meeting him was exactly the point. Coates had arranged the meeting at his office in Forsyth County, low-lit and quiet, a stack of folders squared neatly at the corner of his desk. He listened to my account the same way Coates had, without interruption, without comfort. But when I finished, he slid a single sheet across the desk instead of asking me more questions. An adjuster named Bill Harmon flagged your husband's claim 11 days ago, he said. Camera gap during the exact window of the alleged break-in. No forced entry markers. A valuation on the missing items that came in high, even for insurance purposes. Once a claim gets flagged like that, it doesn't stay with the adjuster alone. It goes to the company's own fraud unit for review, and past a certain dollar amount, they're required to report it to us. That's how this landed on my desk before you ever walked through that door. My chest tightened at the confirmation. Someone else had already seen the same cracks I had, and the system itself had already started moving, quietly, before I'd found the courage to move with it. What you're bringing me, Whitfield said, gives me a person connected to the property who might explain that gap. That's useful. But I want to be plain with you, Mrs. Bennett. This moves slow. Financial records, subpoenas, corroboration. Weeks, sometimes months, not overnight. I understand, I said, though some small, exhausted part of me had hoped otherwise. In the meantime, he said, you go home. You act exactly like you have been. Nothing changes on your end. I left his office with that instruction sitting heavy in my chest, because I already knew something Whitfield didn't. That acting like nothing had changed was getting harder by the day. Thomas had started watching me. Not obviously, not in any way I could have pointed to and named outright. But I felt it in the small silences that stretched a beat too long after I answered him. In the way his eyes lingered on my face when he thought I wasn't paying attention, searching for something he couldn't quite locate. You've been quiet lately, he said that evening, watching me over his coffee instead of the newspaper he was pretending to read. I've had a lot on my mind, I said. So have you, from the sound of it. You never even asked me what the insurance man wanted, he said. Casual. Too casual. Most wives would have asked by now. I trust you're handling it. Something flickered behind his eyes at that. Not quite suspicion. Not yet. But the beginning of a question he didn't know how to ask outright. A man used to being the only one holding secrets in this house, suddenly unsure whether that was still true. You've been different since Paris, he said. Calmer than I expected, given everything. I suppose grief looks different on different people, I said, meeting his eyes and holding them, giving him nothing but the same soft devastation I'd worn since the morning of the sirens. He studied me a moment longer than comfort allowed, then looked away first, reaching for the newspaper like the conversation had never mattered at all. But I felt it long after he'd gone quiet behind that paper. The weight of being watched by a man who no longer fully believed the woman across from him was who she appeared to be. We were circling each other now, each convinced the other didn't see it happening. I wondered, staring at the top of his lowered head, which one of us would slip first. Coates called on a Thursday morning, her voice pitched lower than I'd ever heard it. The kind of careful quiet that told me something had shifted before she said a single word. About what? Whitfield found something, she said. I need you to sit down. I was already sitting, but I gripped the edge of the kitchen table anyway, some old instinct bracing for impact. It took his forensic accountant almost 3 weeks to get here, she said. But once the subpoena went through on Thomas's business accounts, they had a lot of transactions to comb through. Most of it was ordinary. One line wasn't. What line? A wire transfer. $11,000. moved out of Thomas's business account 3 days before the break-in. It went into an account belonging to Odessa Bennett. The name landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. His mother, I said, though it wasn't a question. I already knew. Whitfield cross-referenced that transfer against everything you and Silas gave him. The van's description, the direction it drove off in that night, the temporary dealer tag Silas remembered on Larry's vehicle. Combined with the transfer and the gaps Harmon already flagged in the claim, it's enough. Whitfield's filing for a warrant on Odessa's property. I sat there a long moment, the phone warm against my ear, feeling something complicated rise up through my chest that I couldn't fully name. Relief, yes. The kind that comes when a truth you've carried alone finally has somewhere solid to stand. For weeks, I'd held pieces no one else could see, wondering if they'd ever amount to anything more than a frightened woman's suspicion. Now, they were becoming a case, a real one, with names attached, moving toward consequences I could no longer control or take back. But beneath that relief sat something colder. Odessa had held my hand at our wedding, had taught me her mother's recipe for peach cobbler the first Thanksgiving I spent in this family, patient with my clumsy hands as I learned to fold the dough just right. She'd called me daughter more than once, in moments I'd believed were real. And now her name sat inside a warrant, tied to money moved in secret, days before her son destroyed my trust in everything I thought I understood about this family. "Are you there?" Coates asked when my silence stretched too long. "I'm here," I said. I didn't expect it to reach her too." "These things rarely stay contained to one person," Coates said, gentler now than I'd heard her before. "If she took that money knowingly, she made her own choice the moment she did. You didn't put her there, Mrs. Bennett. Thomas did, the day he decided family loyalty was worth more to him than honesty. I understood the truth in that. I did. But understanding didn't make it feel any less like watching a house I thought was solid crack open along a seam I never knew existed. "What happens now?" I asked. "The warrant executes soon. Once it does, this stops being something only you and I and Whitfield know about. It becomes real, publicly, all at once. I need you ready for that." I thought of Thomas across the breakfast table that morning, watching me with those careful, searching eyes, still convinced he was the only one holding a secret worth protecting. He had no idea how close the walls around him had already grown. "I'm ready," I said, though some part of me wondered if anyone could ever truly be ready to watch a family unravel from the inside, one name at a time. Thomas cornered me in the kitchen the next morning, and I knew before he said a word that this was no longer idle suspicion. "What time did your connecting flight leave, Charlotte?" he asked, not looking up from the coffee he was pouring, voice light in a way that didn't match the question at all. "Why does that matter now?" "Just curious." He set the pot down carefully. "You said you saw the missed calls and turned around. But if your flight to Paris left on time and the layover was in Charlotte, you'd have had to already be in the air before any of this happened. So when exactly did you see those calls?" My pulse climbed, steady and controlled, the way I'd trained it to these past 2 weeks. "On the ground," I said, "before we took off. I told you this already." "Did you?" He turned to face me fully now, something cold and searching behind eyes I used to trust completely. "Because I don't remember you saying that part before." "Thomas, I don't understand why we're relitigating a morning I've already explained. I'm just trying to get the timeline straight," he said, "for the insurance people, in case they ask me again." I held his gaze and gave him absolutely nothing, not a flicker, not a swallow, not the smallest tell that might confirm whatever suspicion had been quietly building behind his careful questions these past days. I had learned, these 2 weeks, Exactly what stillness could cost a person, and exactly what it could protect. "I've told you everything I remember," I said, evenly. "I'd think you'd have bigger things to worry about than my flight times." Something almost broke loose behind his eyes then. The beginning of a real accusation. A real question he might not be able to take back once spoken. His phone rang before he could say it. He answered, still watching me, and I saw the exact moment his whole face changed. Not the careful crumbling he'd shown the officers, or the brief crack I'd witnessed through a doorway with Harmon on the line. This was different. This was a man watching solid ground disappear beneath him in real time. "What do you mean, a warrant?" he said, his voice climbing. "At my mother's house? For what?" I said nothing, my heart hammering so hard I was certain he'd hear it over the phone line himself. "That's insane," he said, though the words came out thinner than he meant them to. "There's been some mistake. Call Larry. Call my mother. This is—" He stopped, listening, his free hand gripping the counter the same way it had the day Harmon first called. "I have to go," he said finally, and hung up without looking at me again, already moving toward the door, already forgetting the questions he'd been circling around me only minutes before. I stood alone in that kitchen for a long moment after the door slammed, my legs finally allowing themselves to shake now that no one was watching to notice. He hadn't finished his question. He never would. Not now. Not with his own mother's house being searched, his brother's name surfacing alongside hers, his entire fabricated grief collapsing all at once, hours before he could ever pin down whatever he'd started to suspect about me. I pressed a hand to my chest and breathed, fully. For what felt like the first time in 2 weeks. It was nearly 5 months before I sat in that courtroom. 5 months of subpoenaed records, grand jury proceedings, and lawyers trading paperwork, while I tried to keep living a life that no longer felt entirely mine. By the time the arraignment finally came, autumn had turned the trees along the courthouse lawn a deep, tired red. Nothing like the summer green that hung over our property the night that van pulled into the drive. The Forsyth County Courthouse smelled like polished wood and old paper, and I sat in the third row wearing the same composed stillness I'd worn all those months. Except this time, for the first time, I didn't have to perform it. Thomas stood at the defense table in a suit I'd once picked out for him, hands folded in front of him, his lawyer murmuring something low near his ear. Larry sat beside his own attorney a few feet down, jaw tight, refusing to look anywhere near the gallery. And Odessa, my Odessa, who'd taught me her mother's cobbler recipe with such patient hands, sat with her eyes fixed on some point on the floor, unable to lift them toward anyone at all. The charges were read aloud, clean and clinical, in a language stripped of everything that had actually happened in my life this past year. Insurance fraud, conspiracy, financial records that traced back further than any of them had planned for. I felt eyes find me across the room before I turned to look. Diane Ashford sat 2 rows back, in the same pearl earrings she'd worn to my house the week after the break-in. The same woman who'd squeezed my hand at church and told me how strong Thomas had been through it all. How devastating it must have been for such a good man to lose his grandmother's silver like that. Our eyes met. She looked away first. Not the polite look away of someone simply moving their gaze elsewhere. The look of someone realizing, in real time, that every kind word she'd offered had been handed to a man who didn't deserve a single one of them. And that she'd have to carry that realization home with her long after this hearing ended. A ripple moved through the gallery behind her, soft and quick. The particular sound a room makes when whispers shift direction all at once. I didn't need to hear the words to understand what was passing between those seats. The story that had traveled through this town for the better part of a year, Poor Thomas, brave Thomas, a man who'd lost so much to strangers in the night, was rearranging itself in real time into something far uglier, far truer. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, spine straight, and let it happen around me without reaching for a single piece of it. I thought of the guest house window, my hand clamped over my own mouth in the dark. Of the tree line I'd walked alone, unsure if I was a fool or a woman finally trusting her own eyes. Of every dinner since where I'd smiled at a man I now understood I'd never really known at all. None of that showed on my face now. It didn't need to. Because the truth was doing the work I'd carried alone all these months, standing up in a public room for everyone who'd once looked at Thomas with sympathy and would now have to sit with what that sympathy had actually protected. I felt something loosen across my shoulders. I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the night that Van pulled into our drive. Not triumph. Nothing so loud as that. Just the quiet, steady weight of finally being believed by people who hadn't even needed me to say a single word. The realtor's sign came down from the front lawn the same week Thomas's sentencing was finalized, and I drove out to the property one last time before the new owners took possession. I hadn't planned to walk back to the guest house. My feet simply carried me there, past the main house already stripped of everything that once made it feel like mine, down the same tree line I'd walked in the dark that night with my suitcase still packed for Paris. The door stuck a little, the way it always had in humid weather, and I let myself in for the last time. Everything sat exactly where I'd left it. The same narrow bed I'd never once lain in that night. The same window, curtain still hanging slightly crooked from where I'd held it back with 2 fingers, watching a van I was never supposed to see. I crossed the room slowly and pressed my palm flat against the window ledge, the wood worn smooth from years of guests who'd rested their hands there without a single thought, never knowing what this small room would come to hold. I remembered my own hand in nearly this same spot, trembling, clamped over my mouth and nose in the dark, forcing silence into a body that wanted to scream. I remembered thinking in that moment that I might be the most foolish woman in the state, hiding from shadows on my own land. I hadn't been foolish. I understood that now, standing here with nothing left to fear. For 2 weeks, I'd carried a truth no one else could see, folding it small enough to hide inside dinners and doorway embraces and careful, rehearsed answers about missed flights. I had wanted, more than once, to simply say it out loud. To stand in front of Thomas and let every word I knew spill across that kitchen table until he had nowhere left to hide from what I'd seen. I hadn't done that. And standing here now, I finally understood why that restraint had mattered more than any confrontation ever could have. A confrontation would have given him a version of the story to fight against. A wife's accusation, her word against his. Easy enough for a man like Thomas to twist into doubt, into sympathy, into the same performance he'd given so effortlessly to police and neighbors alike. My silence had given him nothing to fight at all. Just a truth that grew quietly beneath his feet, gathering weight in wire transfers and dealer plates, and a mother's misplaced trust, until it stood up entirely on its own, in a public room, in front of everyone who needed to see it stand. That was never weakness. I understood that now, running my hand once more along that worn ledge. That had been the only kind of strength I had left to use. I closed the window gently, the same careful motion I'd used that night to keep from making a single sound, though there was no one left to hide from now. Then I walked out of the guest house for the last time, pulling the door shut softly behind me, and didn't look back toward the main house at all. I had already left everything there behind me weeks ago, The night I chose to stay quiet instead of run.